The rain fell mercilessly over Thornwick Cemetery, as if the heavens themselves mourned Dr. Lockwood. Seraphina stood motionless beside the fresh grave, her black mourning dress clinging to her slender frame. 5 years ago, she might have wept openly, but time had taught her to guard her emotions as carefully as the precious few coins remaining in her reticule. "Miss Lockwood, I must speak with you regarding urgent matters of your father's estate." Bartholomew Quill's voice cut through the downpour. The solicitor clutched his hat against the wind, spectacles fogged with rain and anxiety. Seraphina gave a slight nod. "Very well, Mr. Quill. Let us return to the house." The modest drawing room of the Lockerwood residence offered little warmth despite the crackling fire. Lyrianne, Seraphina's younger sister, paced nervously before the hearth while Mr. Quill arranged his papers on the small writing desk. "I fear I bring most troubling news," he began, clearing his throat. "Your father, may he rest in peace, leaves behind substantial debts." "How substantial?" Seraphina asked, her voice steady despite the tightening in her chest. "I regret to inform you that the sum exceeds £2,000, Lyrianne gasped. "Impossible. Father was careful with our finances." "Careful men do not accumulate such debt," Seraphina murmured, her fingers tracing the worn embroidery of her handkerchief. Mr. Quill adjusted his spectacles. "There is more. The primary creditor is His Grace, the Duke of Blackthorn." The name hung in the air like poison. Thaddeus Evermont, the man who had once looked at her with such contempt that the memory still burned through her nightmares. "The Duke has returned from India?" Seraphina asked, proud that her voice betrayed nothing of the storm within. "Indeed, after 5 years abroad, His Grace arrived at Thornwick Hall yesterday." Mr. Quill hesitated. "He requests your presence tomorrow morning." Lyrianne crossed the room, her youthful face flushed with indignation. After what he did to Sarah, the humiliation he caused, he destroyed her chances for a respectable match. "Leary, please," Seraphina cautioned, though the memories flooded back unbidden. The summer ball at Thornwick Hall, her heart pounding as she confessed her admiration to the handsome young Duke, his cruel public rejection, accusing her of being nothing more than a fortune hunter, the whispers that followed her from room to room, town to town. "I shall meet with His Grace," Seraphina declared, rising from her chair. "Sister, you cannot," Lyrianne protested. "We have no choice. Without father's income, we face destitution." Seraphina turned to Mr. Quill. "Please inform the Duke I shall call upon him at 11. After the solicitor departed, Seraphina retreated to her father's study. The room smelled of leather-bound books and the faint tobacco that had been Dr. Lockwood's only indulgence. She lit a single candle, unwilling to waste precious resources, and sank into her father's chair. "Why, father?" she whispered to the shadows. "Why did you leave us with nothing but debts and disgrace?" The gilded mantel clock ticked relentlessly as Seraphina pulled open the desk drawer. Inside lay her most treasured possession, her mother's silver locket. She had pawned everything else of value months ago to pay for her father's medicines. Morning arrived with cruel swiftness. Seraphina dressed in her best gown, a 3-year-old blue muslin, carefully mended and pressed. The mirror reflected a woman of 25, no longer the naive girl who had fallen prey to romantic notions. Her chestnut hair remained her finest feature, though today she wore it severely pinned beneath a modest bonnet. "You look pale," Lyrianne observed, as Seraphina prepared to leave. "Better pale than flushed with fear," Seraphina replied, forcing a smile. "Remember, whatever happens, we still have each other." The carriage ride to Thornwick Hall proved too short for Seraphina to compose herself fully. The grand manor loomed against the clearing sky, its Gothic architecture a testament to generations of Evermont power and wealth. A stern-faced butler led her through marble corridors to the Duke's study. The room had changed little, imposing bookcases, hunting trophies, the massive oak desk before which she had once stood with such foolish hope. "Miss Lockwood," a deep voice announced from the doorway. Seraphina turned, her rehearsed greeting dying on her lips. Thaddeus Evermont was not the same man who had left England. The golden-haired youth had been replaced by a harder, leaner figure. A jagged scar traced his left cheekbone, disappearing into his neatly trimmed beard. His once bright blue eyes had deepened to the color of a winter sea. "Your Grace," she managed, executing a perfect curtsy. "Please be seated." He gestured to a chair before crossing to the window. "I trust Mr. Quill explained the situation regarding your father's debts." "He did. Then you understand your precarious position." Seraphina lifted her chin. "I understand that my father owed you money, Your Grace. I do not understand why you summoned me here." Thaddeus turned, studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. I have a proposition, Miss Lockwood, one that would resolve your financial difficulties permanently. I am listening. Marriage, he stated flatly. I require a wife, and you require security. The word fell between them like a stone into still water, sending ripples of shock through Serafina's carefully maintained composure. Is this some cruel jest? She whispered. I never jest about business, Miss Lockwood, and make no mistake, this would be a business arrangement, nothing more. For several moments, Serafina could not trust herself to speak. The grandfather clock in the corner marked each second with merciless precision as she fought to master her shock. You wish to marry me? She finally asked, her voice barely audible. After you publicly declared me beneath your contempt 5 years ago? Circumstances change, Miss Lockwood. Thaddeus moved to his desk, settling into the leather chair with the ease of a man accustomed to power. My father's will contains certain stipulations. I must be married before my 30th birthday to receive my full inheritance. And that date approaches? 3 months hence. Serafina's laugh held no humor. How convenient that you remembered my existence just when you require a bride. The Duke's expression remained impassive, but his fingers tapped once against the polished wood. You are a practical choice. Your father was respected despite his financial mismanagement. Your bloodline, while not aristocratic, is untainted by scandal, save the one I created. You speak as though selecting a broodmare, Serafina observed coolly. I speak as a man who requires a wife without romantic expectations. His gaze sharpened. Most women of marriageable age harbor illusions about love. You, I suspect, have been cured of such notions. The truth of his assessment stung more than any insult. And what of your reputation? Surely the Ton will question why the illustrious Duke of Blackthorn chose a penniless doctor's daughter. Society gossips about what it doesn't understand. They will assume I've taken you as penance for ruining you, or perhaps that I succumbed to some inexplicable passion. His lips curved in a humorless smile. Either way, the matter will be discussed for a fortnight before some new scandal emerges. The door flew open without warning. Lyrianne burst in, cheeks flushed, her bonnet askew. Sarah, the carriage lost a wheel, and I feared you'd... She halted abruptly, eyes widening as they fell upon Thaddeus. You, Lyrianne! Serafina rose quickly. You should not be here. Indeed not, the Duke agreed coldly. This is a private discussion. Lyrianne drew herself up, remarkably poised for a girl of 19, facing one of England's most powerful men. Private? When it concerns my sister's welfare? I think not, Your Grace. You've grown bold, Miss Lyrianne, Thaddeus remarked, studying her with faint surprise. And you've grown cruel, if you think to torment my sister further. Lyrianne moved protectively to Serafina's side. Haven't you done enough? Thaddeus's jaw tightened. Your sister and I have business matters to discuss. What business could possibly? His Grace has proposed marriage, Serafina interrupted quietly. Lyrianne's mouth fell open. Marriage? To you? After everything? She turned to the Duke, color high in her cheeks. Is this some new method of humiliation? Your concern is admirable but misplaced, Thaddeus said. I am offering your sister security, position, and wealth. The alternative is debtor's prison for your father's obligations. How dare you threaten us? Lyrianne's voice rose dangerously. Lyri, please! Serafina squeezed her sister's hand. Wait for me in the carriage. I won't leave you alone with him. You will, Serafina insisted, her tone brooking no argument. I can manage this conversation. After Lyrianne departed, reluctantly and with a final glare at the Duke, silence reclaimed the study. Serafina returned her attention to Thaddeus, noting the rigid set of his shoulders, the barely perceptible tension in his jaw. For all his apparent coldness, something within him was not entirely at ease. Your terms, Your Grace, she prompted. They are simple. You become my wife in name and public appearance. Your father's debts will be forgiven. You and your sister will want for nothing materially. And my duties? Serafina forced herself to ask, heat creeping up her neck. Something flickered in his eyes. Discomfort, perhaps. An heir will eventually be necessary. However, I have no immediate expectations in that regard. Serafina swallowed hard. I see. You would have your own suite of rooms, freedom to pursue appropriate interests, a generous allowance. He enumerated these points clinically. I ask only that you maintain the dignity expected of a duchess and support my political endeavors when required. A business arrangement indeed. She studied him, searching for any hint of the young man she had once admired. There was none. May I ask why you selected me specifically? Surely there are more advantageous matches available, even with your deadline. Thaddeus rose, moving to stand before the window. For a moment, his silhouette against the morning light appeared almost vulnerable. Most eligible women would expect love, or at least the pretense of it, he said finally. They would demand attention, affection, romantic gestures I have no interest in providing. You, Miss Lockwood, have reason to expect nothing from me but the terms I've outlined. How efficient of you, she murmured. He turned, his gaze meeting hers directly. I require an answer by tomorrow. My solicitor will call upon you with the settlement papers should you accept. Serafina rose, smoothing her skirts with hands that betrayed the slightest tremor. You have given me much to consider, Your Grace. Indeed. Thaddeus moved to open the door. One last thing, Miss Lockwood. She paused on the threshold, not quite meeting his eyes. I am no longer the man who humiliated you 5 years ago, he said quietly. Nor are you the girl who invited such cruelty. Perhaps we may both find this arrangement less odious than it appears. It was as close to an apology as she was likely to receive. Serafina offered a curtsy in response, then walked with measured steps through the grand hallway, past the servants whose curious gazes followed her progress. Only when safely inside the carriage, with Lyriane clutching her hands and demanding explanations, did Serafina allow herself to contemplate what accepting Thaddeus Evermont's proposal truly meant, becoming mistress of the house where her heart had first been broken, and wife to the man who had broken it. Chapter 3. Mansion of Secrets. The early morning light, filtering through the leaded glass windows of Thornwick Hall, cast geometric patterns across Serafina's bedchamber floor. She had been Duchess of Blackthorn for precisely 3 days, and still the title felt like an ill-fitting garment, simultaneously too large for her station and too constraining for her spirit. The wedding had been a quiet affair at the village church, with only Lyriane, Mr. Quill, and a handful of servants as witnesses. Thaddeus had been punctual, properly attired, and utterly detached. He spoke his vows clearly, placed a magnificent diamond ring upon her finger, and escorted her to the waiting carriage without once meeting her eyes directly. The marriage documents were signed, the debts officially forgiven, and Serafina's transformation from disgraced spinster to duchess was complete. Your morning tea, Your Grace, came a timid voice as her new lady's maid, Flora, entered with a silver tray. Thank you, Flora, Serafina replied, still unused to being addressed with such deference. And please, when we are alone, you may call me Miss Serafina as you did when we were girls. Flora smiled cautiously. Mrs. Vex would not approve. Mrs. Pruella Vex, housekeeper of Thornwick Hall for 30 years and self-appointed guardian of its traditions. Since Serafina's arrival, the stern-faced woman had regarded her with thinly veiled suspicion. Mrs. Vex disapproves of many things, I suspect. Serafina accepted the tea, inhaling the fragrant steam. Has His Grace departed already? Before dawn, Your Grace. He mentioned business in the village. Serafina nodded, unsurprised. Thaddeus had maintained a careful distance since their wedding night, when he had escorted her to this chamber, bowed formally, and departed to his own suite without comment. I should like to tour the house properly this morning, Serafina decided. I've seen only a fraction of it thus far. Shall I accompany you? Flora asked. No need. I prefer to explore alone. Once dressed in a simple morning gown of pale green muslin, Serafina ventured into the labyrinthine corridors of Thornwick Hall. The ancestral seat of the Evermont family was a curious blend of architectural styles, Tudor foundations with Georgian additions and Gothic embellishments. Portraits of stern-faced dukes and their elegant duchesses lined the grand gallery, their painted eyes following her intrusion into their domain. Serafina paused before a portrait of Thaddeus's father, the late Duke. His cold blue eyes bore a striking resemblance to his son's, but lacked the haunted quality she occasionally glimpsed in Thaddeus. Beside him hung a smaller portrait of a delicate woman with auburn hair, Thaddeus's mother, who had died when he was 13. The Duchess Alexandra, came a voice behind her, a gentle soul ill-suited to her position. Serafina turned to find Mrs. Vex watching her, thin arms folded across her black bombazine dress. How did she die? Serafina asked, noting the housekeeper's guarded expression. A fever, very sudden. Mrs. Vex's tone discouraged further inquiry. His Grace has instructed that you be given free access to all parts of the house, save his private study. If you require anything, you need only ask. Thank you, Mrs. Vex. I appreciate your assistance during this adjustment period. The housekeeper inclined her head stiffly. I have served Thornwick Hall since before His Grace was born. My loyalty is to the Evermont family and its preservation. The unspoken message was clear. Serafina was an outsider, tolerated, but not yet accepted as part of that family. A commendable dedication, Serafina replied evenly. I trust we shall work together to maintain the standards of this household. Left alone once more, Serafina continued her exploration. The massive library beckoned with its promise of solitude. 2 stories of leather-bound volumes surrounded a central reading area, where comfortable chairs faced a marble fireplace. Large windows overlooked the formal gardens, currently being revived after years of neglect during Thaddeus's absence. As she wandered among the shelves, Serafina's attention was drawn to a section of books that appeared more frequently handled than others. Medical texts, philosophical treatises, and several volumes on Eastern cultures stood together in a curious collection. She selected one titled Ancient Practices of Ayurvedic Medicine, opening it to find marginal notes in a precise hand she assumed to be Thaddeus's. Interesting choice, Serafina started, nearly dropping the book. Thaddeus stood in the doorway, riding boots still dusty from his morning excursion. I was merely browsing, she explained, returning the volume to its place. You need not explain yourself. These books are now as much yours as mine. He approached, his movements fluid yet somehow cautious, like a predator uncertain of its welcome. Do you read medical texts often? My father encouraged intellectual pursuits. I assisted with his medical journals and correspondence. I had forgotten your father's progressive views on female education. A shadow of something, regret perhaps, crossed his features. If there are specific volumes you desire, inform Hillcrest, the librarian. He will procure them. Thank you. Serafina hesitated. May I ask where you traveled this morning? The tenant farms required inspection. The steward has been lax in my absence. Thaddeus moved to a side table, pouring amber liquid from a decanter. Will you join me for dinner this evening? I believe we should establish certain routines. Of course. He nodded, downing his drink in a single swallow. 8 o'clock then. After he departed, Serafina released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Every interaction with Thaddeus felt like navigating treacherous waters, calm on the surface, but with dangerous currents below. Later that afternoon, seeking refuge from Mrs. Vex's omnipresent scrutiny, Serafina discovered a small door concealed behind a tapestry near the library. Curiosity overcoming propriety, she followed the narrow staircase it revealed to a circular room in one of the manor's turrets. Dust sheets covered the furniture, but someone had clearly visited recently. A single chair was uncovered, and beside it stood a small table bearing a leather-bound journal. Conscience warred briefly with curiosity before the latter prevailed. Serafina opened the journal to find childish handwriting that gradually matured across its pages. It was Thaddeus's diary, begun at age 10. Most entries were mundane accounts of lessons and hunts, but occasionally darker passages emerged. Father struck me again today. Mother wept but said nothing. Always nothing. Found mother's medicine hidden beneath her mattress. The physician claims it soothes her nerves. She seems more ghost than woman lately. The final entry, dated shortly after his mother's death, contained only 5 words. She knew too much. Silence. Troubled by the discovery, Serafina carefully replaced the journal and returned downstairs. The dinner hour approached, and she had yet to prepare for her first formal meal with her husband. At precisely 8 o'clock, Serafina entered the smaller dining room where Thaddeus awaited. Candlelight softened the angles of his face, rendering him momentarily reminiscent of the young man she had once admired from afar. You look well, he offered stiffly as she took her seat. Thank you. She accepted a glass of wine from the footman. Has your day been productive? Moderately so. He studied her briefly. And yours? Has Thornwick Hall revealed its secrets to you? Something in his tone made her wonder if he knew about her discovery in the turret room. Old houses always keep some secrets, she replied carefully. A faint smile touched his lips. Indeed they do. Their conversation remained politely distant throughout the meal, touching on estate matters and local gossip, but avoiding any subject of personal significance. Only as dessert was served did Thaddeus broach a more intimate topic. Your sister is welcome to join us here, he said suddenly. I've had rooms prepared in the East Wing. Surprised by the gesture, Serafina set down her spoon. That's most generous, but Lyrianne has accepted an invitation from our aunt in Bath. She departed this morning. I see. He seemed almost disappointed. Should you wish to write to her, my courier can ensure swift delivery. Why did you return from India? The question escaped before Serafina could reconsider its boldness. Thaddeus's expression closed like a shutter against rain. My father's will, as I explained. No other reason? 5 years is a significant absence. His fingers tightened imperceptibly around his wineglass. There were complications in Bombay that necessitated my return to England. Business matters of some delicacy. Dangerous business, judging by your scar, she observed quietly. His hand rose involuntarily to his cheek. A reminder of carelessness, he muttered. One of many. When he looked at her again, there was a new wariness in his gaze, as though he had revealed more than intended. We are strangers who find ourselves bound by legal contract, Serafina. I suggest we maintain appropriate distance until we better understand one another's boundaries. As you wish, Your Grace, she replied, the formality a shield against the unexpected hurt his words provoked. That night, alone in her bedchamber, Serafina stood by the window overlooking the moonlit gardens of Thornwick Hall. Somewhere within these walls dwelled the truth about Thaddeus Evermont, a man scarred by more than just the visible mark upon his face, a man who had married her for convenience, yet showed flashes of something deeper beneath his cold exterior, a man whose secrets might prove more dangerous than her heart could bear. The annual Blackthorn Masquerade Ball had been a fixture of the county's social calendar for generations. Traditionally held at midsummer, it marked the pinnacle of the local season, a night when aristocracy mingled with gentry, fortunes were wagered at card tables, and matrimonial schemes were hatched beneath crystal chandeliers. That Thaddeus had chosen to maintain the tradition after 5 years' absence surprised many, not least his new Duchess. I had assumed we would forego social engagements during our first months of marriage, Serafina remarked, as they reviewed the guest list in the morning room. 3 weeks had passed since their wedding, during which they had established a routine of careful civility. Social obligations cannot be indefinitely postponed, Thaddeus replied, not looking up from the documents before him. The ball serves multiple purposes beyond mere entertainment. Political alliances are formed, business arrangements solidified, and gossip exchanged, she added wryly. His lips curved slightly. Indeed, better to face society's scrutiny directly than allow speculation to flourish unchecked. Serafina smoothed the embossed invitation, trying to quell her apprehension. They will all be watching us, measuring every glance, every word. Let them watch. Thaddeus set down his pen, finally meeting her gaze. We need only present a united front. After that, the novelty will diminish. Easy for him to say, Serafina thought. He was not the one who had been humiliated before this same society 5 years earlier. The week before, the ball passed in a flurry of preparations. Serafina found herself thrust into the role of hostess, overseeing menus, floral arrangements, and 100 other details. Mrs. Vex's assistants, while efficient, remained coldly professional, offering little warmth or encouragement. On the afternoon before the ball, Monsieur Zéphirin Châtel arrived from London with Serafina's gown, a commission Thaddeus had arranged without her knowledge. Your Grace will be magnificent, simply magnificent, the French couturier declared, unveiling his creation in her dressing room. Serafina's breath caught at the sight. The gown was midnight blue silk, embellished with thousands of tiny crystals that mimicked the night sky. Its neckline was daring without being improper, its silhouette elegant yet distinctive. It's beautiful, she admitted, fingering the delicate fabric. His Grace was most specific about the color, Monsieur Châtel confided. He said it must complement your eyes exactly. Serafina glanced up in surprise. The Duke selected the color himself. But of course, and the design as well. He has an excellent eye, though he pretends otherwise. The couturier smiled knowingly. Men of power often disguise their sensitivity, n'est-ce pas? The thought of Thaddeus concerning himself with such details unsettled her in ways she could not articulate. That evening, as Flora arranged her hair with sapphire pins, another unexpected gift from her husband, Serafina studied her reflection in the looking-glass. The woman who gazed back seemed a stranger, poised, elegant, adorned as befitted her station. Only her eyes remained unchanged, still carrying the wariness that had become her constant companion. His Grace awaits you in the grand hall, Your Grace, Flora announced, adjusting the final pin. Serafina descended the marble staircase with measured steps, acutely aware of the servants lining the entrance hall. Thaddeus stood at the foot of the stairs, resplendent in formal evening attire, his fair hair gleaming beneath the chandelier light. As their eyes met, Something flickered in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or appreciation. "You do the gown justice," he said quietly, offering his arm. "Thank you for selecting it," she replied. "It was most thoughtful." His mouth quirked. "Practical, rather. The Duchess of Blackthorn must outshine every woman present." By 9 o'clock, Thornwick Hall blazed with light and music. Carriages lined the circular drive, disgorging guests in their masked finery. As hostess, Serafina stood beside Thaddeus in the receiving line, greeting each arrival with a composure that belied her inner tension. "You're performing admirably," Thaddeus murmured between introductions. "One would think you born to the role." "Years of observing my betters," she returned with a hint of irony. His low chuckle surprised her. "Careful, Duchess. I begin to suspect you possess a sharper wit than you reveal." The Earl and Countess of Westmoreland approached next, longtime friends of the Evermont family, and among the most influential couples in the county. "Thaddeus, my boy," the Earl clapped him on the shoulder. "Damned good to have you back in England. India clearly agreed with you despite that impressive scar." "Lord Westmoreland, Lady Westmoreland." Thaddeus inclined his head. "May I present my wife, the Duchess of Blackthorn?" The Countess's assessment was swift and penetrating. "Miss Lockwood, is it not? The physician's daughter? How unexpected." "Your Grace now," Thaddeus corrected smoothly, his hand coming to rest at the small of Serafina's back. "And I assure you, the most fortunate decision of my life." The possessive gesture, combined with his words, sent warmth coursing through Serafina's veins. She recognized the performance for what it was, a calculated display for their audience, yet could not deny its effect upon her traitorous heart. As the evening progressed, Serafina navigated the treacherous waters of aristocratic society with increasing confidence. She exchanged pleasantries with dowagers who had once snubbed her, discussed literature with scholarly gentlemen, and deflected impertinent questions about her sudden elevation with practiced grace. During a momentary respite from social obligations, she found herself approached by a gentleman wearing a silver fox mask, the Viscount Oriel Fawnley, recently returned from the continent. "Your Grace," he bowed elegantly, "may I offer my congratulations on your marriage? The Duke is fortunate indeed." "You're most kind, Lord Fawnley." Something in his manner put her instantly at ease, a rarity among Thaddeus's peers. "Not kindness, but honesty, I assure you." His smile was warm beneath his mask. "I knew your father slightly, consulted him about a riding injury some years ago. A brilliant man and uncommonly decent." "You knew my father?" Serafina's reserve softened. Few among tonight's guests would admit such an acquaintance. "I've never understood the aristocracy's disdain for those who actually contribute to society." He gestured toward the dancing couples. "Shall we scandalize them further by sharing a quadrille?" Serafina hesitated. "I should consult my husband." "Your husband appears occupied." Fawnley nodded toward a corner where Thaddeus conversed intensely with two older gentlemen. "Besides, I've known Evermont since Eton. He'll hardly object to an old friend dancing with his Duchess." The dance proved a welcome diversion, Fawnley's conversation both intelligent and refreshingly devoid of the condescension she had come to expect. As they completed the final figure, he remarked, "Should you ever require a friend at court, so to speak, I hope you will consider me at your service." Before she could respond, Thaddeus materialized beside them, his expression unreadable behind his black domino mask. "Fawnley, I see you've met my wife." "Indeed. You've chosen exceptionally well, Blackthorn." The Viscount bowed to them both. "I was just assuring her Grace that old friends of her father still exist in society." Something dangerous flashed in Thaddeus's eyes. "How magnanimous of you." "If you'll excuse me," Fawnley said, seemingly oblivious to the sudden tension, "Lady Pembroke has promised me the next dance." As he departed, Thaddeus's hand closed around Serafina's elbow. "A word, if you please." He guided her through the crowded ballroom to a small antechamber, closing the door to afford them privacy. "I would advise caution regarding Fawnley." Serafina removed her mask, suddenly weary of pretense. "He was perfectly courteous, more so than most of your friends." "He is not my friend," Thaddeus replied sharply, "and his courtesy invariably masks ulterior motives." "What possible motive could he have for being kind to your inconvenient wife?" she challenged. Thaddeus removed his own mask, revealing features taut with some unnamed emotion. "Information. Access. There are many who would use you to reach me." "How flattering," she murmured, turning away. "I had not realized I might serve as bait." His hand caught her wrist, the touch sending unwelcome awareness coursing through her. "That is not what I meant." "Then explain yourself clearly, husband." I grow tired of cryptic warnings and half-truths. For a moment it seemed he might actually confide in her. Then the orchestra in the ballroom struck up a waltz, breaking the fragile connection between them. The first waltz, he said instead. Traditionally danced by the host and hostess. Of course, Serafina replaced her mask, rebuilding her composure. We mustn't disappoint our audience. In the ballroom, couples parted to form a circle around them. Thaddeus bowed formally. Serafina curtsied in response. Then his hand was at her waist, hers upon his shoulder, their gloved fingers intertwined. 5 years earlier, she had dreamed of dancing with him thus. Now caught in the reality of his embrace, Serafina found herself both fulfilling and mourning that youthful fantasy. They moved together with unexpected harmony, their bodies finding a natural rhythm that belied the discord between them. You dance well, he observed, guiding her through a turn. My father believed in a comprehensive education, she replied. Even for daughters unlikely to enter ballrooms such as this. He would be proud to see you now. Would he? Serafina met his gaze directly. Or would he be appalled to see his daughter in a marriage of convenience, bound to a man who once publicly humiliated her? The music swelled around them as Thaddeus drew her imperceptibly closer. Perhaps both, he admitted softly. As am I. Before she could decipher his meaning, a woman's voice interrupted their exchange. Thaddeus Evermont, how perfectly barbaric of you to return from India without so much as a letter of warning. They turned to find a striking woman watching them, her red lips curved in a smile that never reached her eyes. Her gown of crimson silk clung provocatively to her figure, her mask a confection of black lace and rubies. Lady Morgause, Thaddeus's voice cooled noticeably. I wasn't aware you had been invited. The Westmorlands were kind enough to include me in their party. Her gaze shifted to Serafina, assessing and dismissive in a single glance. And this must be your bride. How charming. Lady Morgause Wraithborn, may I present Her Grace, the Duchess of Blackthorn? Thaddeus said stiffly. Enchanted, Lady Morgause drawled. What a remarkable elevation for the daughter of a country doctor. Serafina smiled placidly. Indeed, though not nearly as remarkable as your ladyship's ability to deliver insults disguised as pleasantries. A flash of genuine amusement crossed Thaddeus's features before he suppressed it. Lady Morgause's perfect lips thinned. Directness. How refreshing in a duchess. I wonder, has your husband shared his Indian adventures with you? His time with the mysterious Naira, perhaps? The name struck like a physical blow, though Serafina maintained her composure. His Grace's diplomatic service abroad hardly constitutes drawing-room conversation, Lady Morgause. Diplomatic service? Lady Morgause laughed lightly. Is that what he calls it? How discreet. Enough, Thaddeus's voice cut like steel. So you forget yourself, Morgause. Do I? She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a mock whisper. Or do you forget that secrets rarely remain buried, especially those sealed with blood? She tapped Serafina's arm with her closed fan. Do ask your husband about Naira, Your Grace. Her fate might interest you as a cautionary tale. With that, she glided away into the crowd, leaving a chill in her wake that even the warmth of the ballroom could not dispel. The aftermath of the masquerade ball left a palpable tension hanging over Thornwick Hall. 3 days had passed since Lady Morgause's veiled accusations, yet Thaddeus had offered no explanation regarding the mysterious Naira. Instead, he had retreated behind the barricade of his private study, emerging only for solitary rides across the estate and silent dinners that ended as quickly as propriety allowed. Serafina, left to navigate her new position without guidance, threw herself into household duties. She reviewed accounts with Mrs. Vex, visited tenant cottages with baskets of supplies, and catalogued the neglected library, all while pondering the enigma of her husband. On the 4th morning, as she breakfasted alone in the morning room, a commotion in the stables drew her attention. Through the window she observed grooms and stable boys rushing about in obvious distress. Setting aside her teacup, she made her way to the courtyard. What has happened? She inquired of the head groom, who stood grimly by the stable entrance. The Duke's favourite hunters, Your Grace, he replied, removing his cap. Brimstone and Tempest, found frothing and thrashing at dawn. Poisoned by the look of it. Poisoned? Serafina's hand flew to her throat. Deliberately, you mean? Can't say for certain, Your Grace, but they were fine at evening feed. The Duke is with them now. Inside the dim stable, Serafina found Thaddeus kneeling beside his fallen horses, his shirt sleeves rolled up, hands stained with medicinal paste. The magnificent black stallions lay on fresh straw, their breathing labored, eyes rolling in distress. "What can I do?" Serafina asked quietly. Thaddeus glanced up, surprise momentarily displacing his concern. "You should not be here. I have some knowledge of medicinal herbs," she persisted. "My father—" "Fetch me more of this paste," he interrupted, indicating a small pot beside him. "And fresh water. They must be kept hydrated if they are to survive." For the next 2 hours, they worked side by side in grim silence, applying poultices, administering herbal solutions, and monitoring the horse's vital signs. Serafina's hands moved with practiced efficiency, recalling her father's lessons on treating livestock poisonings. "Monk's hood," she muttered, examining a residue in the water trough, mixed with nightshade. "Deadly in combination." Thaddeus's head snapped up. "You're certain?" "The symptoms are distinctive. My father documented several cases after a contaminated shipment of feed nearly decimated Farmer Willoughby's herd." She wiped her brow with her sleeve, heedless of propriety. "Who would do this?" "The same person who set fire to the library last week, I suspect." Serafina stared at him. "What fire?" "I was told a lamp had been overturned." "A convenient explanation," he replied grimly, "as was the loose tile that nearly struck you in the garden yesterday. You believe these are deliberate attacks?" Thaddeus sat back on his heels, exhaustion briefly claiming his features. "I know they are." Understanding dawned. "Your business in India. It followed you home." "Yes." His admission was barely audible. "And now endangers all within these walls." Before she could press further, the stable door opened to reveal Mrs. Vex, her normally impeccable appearance slightly disheveled. "Your Grace, there's been an incident at the North Gatehouse. Attempted break-in. The gatekeeper has detained the suspect." Thaddeus rose swiftly. "Have Simmons continue the treatment regimen," he instructed Serafina. "I shall return shortly." "I'm coming with you," she replied, standing her ground when he frowned. "If Thornwick Hall is under threat, I should know the nature of our enemies." Something that might have been respect flickered across his face. After a moment's hesitation, he nodded curtly. "Very well." The North Gatehouse stood a quarter-mile from the main house, guarding the private road that connected Thornwick Hall to neighboring estates. As their carriage approached, Serafina noted the sturdy stone structure, its narrow windows more suitable for a fortress than a decorative entrance. Inside, they found the gatekeeper, a burly former soldier, standing guard over a thin, ragged boy of perhaps 13 years. The child's eyes widened in terror at the sight of the Duke. "Found him trying to jimmy the service door, Your Grace," the gatekeeper reported. "Had these on him." He displayed a set of crude lockpicks and a folded note. Thaddeus examined the tools, then turned his attention to the note, his expression darkening as he read its contents. "Who sent you?" he demanded of the boy. "Don't know, my lord," the child stammered. "Man in the village paid me 6pence to deliver the tools and paper to whoever answered the door." "Describe this man." "Tall gentleman, fine clothes, had a scar here." The boy indicated his chin. "Spoke fancy-like." Thaddeus exchanged a significant glance with Serafina. "Thornley," he murmured. "You can't be certain," she cautioned. "I recognize his methods." He turned back to the boy. "You'll not be punished, but you must remain here until arrangements can be made for your safety." The child's eyes filled with tears. "Me mam will worry. I shall personally inform your mother of your whereabouts," Serafina interjected, her heart softening at the boy's distress. "What is your name, and where does she reside?" "Tommy Fletcher, mum. We live behind the chandler's shop in the village." Serafina nodded reassuringly. "Rest easy, Tommy. You'll be reunited with your mother soon." As they returned to the carriage, Thaddeus handed her the note he had confiscated. "Read it," he said grimly. The message, written in an elegant hand, contained only 5 words. "The merchant's ledger for Naira." "What does it mean?" Serafina asked. Thaddeus's jaw tightened. "It means we have a traitor within our household." That evening, after ensuring Tommy Fletcher's safe return to his worried mother, with a generous sum that Serafina insisted would compensate for his lost wages, they gathered in Thaddeus's private study. Mrs. Vex joined them, along with Simmons, the Duke's valet, and Hillcrest, the elderly librarian, the only servants Thaddeus trusted implicitly. "The attacks are escalating," Thaddeus began without preamble. "First the library fire, then the falling masonry, now the horses and this attempted infiltration. They grow desperate," Mrs. Vex observed coolly. "The timetable must have changed." Serafina glanced between them, noting the unspoken understanding. "What timetable? And who precisely is they?" Thaddeus paced before the fireplace, hands clasped behind his back. "In India, I uncovered evidence of systematic corruption within the East India Company, officials diverting company funds to private accounts, smuggling opium beyond approved channels, using military resources for personal vendettas. You were sent to investigate these matters? Serafina asked. A bitter smile touched his lips. No, I was meant to be a figurehead, a young, dissolute nobleman whose title would open doors while more experienced minds managed actual business. Instead, I discovered documents implicating several prominent directors, including Lord Caldwell. Lord Caldwell? The company's chairman? Serafina recalled the distinguished silver-haired gentleman who had served in Parliament for decades. The very same. A man of impeccable reputation and the architect of a scheme that has cost countless lives. Thaddeus's voice hardened. When I began asking questions, certain parties attempted to ensure my permanent silence. He gestured to the scar on his cheek. A midnight encounter with paid assassins. I survived, my manservant did not. Serafina's hand flew to her mouth. How terrible. After recovering, I cultivated a different persona, the dissipated nobleman they had initially expected. I gambled, drank publicly, consorted with dancing girls, while secretly gathering evidence. His eyes darkened with memory. One such informant was Naira, a translator for the company. She accessed documents that proved Caldwell's complicity. The woman Lady Morgause mentioned, Serafina realized. What happened to her? Thaddeus turned away, staring into the fire. She was discovered. Her body was found in the Bombay harbor 3 days later. A heavy silence fell over the room. Finally, Serafina spoke. And you returned to England to expose Lord Caldwell. With evidence he believes died with Naira, Thaddeus confirmed. But she had already transmitted the most damning documents, encoded in merchant ledgers that appear innocuous to casual inspection, which your enemies now seek, Mrs. Vex interjected. Hence the note. Precisely. They believe I keep these ledgers here at Thornwick Hall. Thaddeus's gaze returned to Serafina. What they do not realize is that the documents are secured elsewhere, awaiting the appropriate moment to be revealed. And Lord Fawnley is involved in this conspiracy? Serafina struggled to reconcile the amiable Viscount with such villainy. Fawnley is Caldwell's nephew and primary beneficiary, Thaddeus explained. He has every reason to protect his uncle's interests and fortune. Understanding dawned with chilling clarity. This is why you returned to England, why you needed a wife so quickly. She straightened her shoulders. You required a social shield, someone to establish your presence in society while you continued your investigation. Thaddeus had the grace to look discomfited. I required a partner I could trust not to be seduced by Caldwell's circle. His voice softened. Someone with intelligence and integrity. Someone who had already witnessed my worst behavior and could not be easily deceived about my character. You might have simply explained this from the beginning, she observed, uncertain whether to feel flattered or manipulated. And risk making you a target? He shook his head. The less you knew, the safer you remained. A strategy that has clearly failed, Mrs. Vex noted dryly. Her Grace is now as much a target as yourself, by virtue of her position. The conversation continued late into the night, with Thaddeus revealing the extent of his evidence against Caldwell and his co-conspirators. Plans were made to increase security around the estate, and trusted messengers were dispatched to contact Thaddeus's allies in London. As they finally retired, Serafina found Thaddeus accompanying her to her chambers, the first time he had done so since their wedding night. I regret involving you in this danger, he said quietly, as they paused outside her door. It was never my intention. Yet here we are, she replied, partners in a conspiracy neither of us fully anticipated. He studied her face in the dim light of the corridor. You've shown remarkable courage today, Serafina. Many women would have collapsed into hysterics at half the revelations. I am not many women, she reminded him. No, he agreed softly. You are singular in ways I failed to appreciate 5 years ago. The admission hung between them, fragile as spun glass. Serafina felt a dangerous warmth spreading through her chest, the stirring of feelings she had sworn never to resurrect. Good night, Thaddeus, she said, retreating behind her door before temptation could overcome wisdom. The following morning dawned clear and bright, belying the shadows that now colored Serafina's understanding of her situation. As she dressed for the day, a messenger arrived, bearing an unexpected letter from Lyrian. Dearest Sarah, Bath is utterly delightful. Aunt Margaret has introduced me to all manner of interesting people, including a most attentive young gentleman who serves as private secretary to Lord Caldwell. Mr. Oswin is exceedingly well-spoken, and has invited me to several exclusive gatherings. Can you imagine? Your little sister, moving in such elevated circles. He has expressed particular interest in your marriage to the Duke, asking such thoughtful questions about Thornwick Hall and your husband's activities. I assure you, I've been the model of discretion, though I confess to enjoying the attention immensely. With deepest affection, Lirianne. The letter slipped from Seraphina's suddenly nerveless fingers. Caldwell had found another avenue to infiltrate Thornwick Hall. Through her unsuspecting sister, Seraphina ran through the corridors of Thornwick Hall, heedless of the startled servants she passed. The pounding of her heart matched the rhythm of her footsteps against the marble floors as she clutched Lirianne's letter like a talisman. She found Thaddeus in the stables, consulting with the veterinarian about his recovering horses. "My sister," she gasped, thrusting the letter toward him. "Caldwell has reached her." Thaddeus dismissed the veterinarian with a curt nod before scanning the contents of Lirianne's innocent correspondence. His expression darkened with each line. "This Oswin is no secretary," he said grimly. "He's Caldwell's enforcer, a man responsible for at least 3 disappearances in India." He looked up, meeting her frightened gaze. "When did you receive this?" "Just now, Thaddeus. She has no idea of the danger." "We leave for Bath within the hour," he interrupted, already striding toward the house. "Pack only essentials. I'll have the fastest carriage readied." Seraphina hurried to match his pace. "Should we send word ahead? Warn Lirianne to—" "No," he said sharply. "Any message might be intercepted, alerting Oswin that we've discovered his game." His hand briefly touched her arm, the contact surprisingly gentle despite his urgent tone. "We will reach her in time, Seraphina. I promise you." Within 40 minutes, they were on the road to Bath, the countryside blurring past the carriage windows. Seraphina sat rigid with worry, her mind conjuring increasingly terrible scenarios involving her impulsive, trusting sister. "Lirianne is intelligent," Thaddeus offered after they had traveled in tense silence for nearly an hour. "She will sense something amiss in this man's attentions." "She is 19 and flattered by the interest of a sophisticated gentleman," Seraphina countered, "the age when I made a similar error of judgment." The reference to their past hung awkwardly between them. After a moment, Thaddeus spoke again, his voice lower. "I have never properly apologized for that night." Seraphina looked up in surprise. "There is no need." "There is every need," he insisted. "My behavior was inexcusable. I humiliated you publicly to satisfy my father's twisted sense of social order." The admission stunned her. "Your father?" Thaddeus's jaw tightened. "He observed our conversations throughout the season, believed you were orchestrating a campaign to entrap me into marriage." His laugh held no humor. "When I defended your character, he threatened to cut off my younger brother's allowance at university. Alexander was already in debt, would have been ruined." "So you sacrificed my reputation to protect your brother," Seraphina murmured. "I convinced myself it was the honorable choice," he admitted, "that your heart would recover more easily than Alexander's future." His eyes, when they met hers, contained a rawness she had never witnessed. "I was a coward, taking the path that caused me least inconvenience while destroying something precious." The carriage hit a particularly rough section of road, jostling them against each other. Thaddeus steadied her with an instinctive hand, the warmth of his palm burning through the fabric of her traveling dress. "I don't expect forgiveness," he continued quietly, "but you deserve the truth." Seraphina studied his face, the aristocratic features now lined with experiences that had transformed the arrogant youth into something more complex. "The truth is rarely simple, is it? Especially between us." Their journey continued through the day and into evening, stopping only to change horses at carefully selected posting houses where Thaddeus was confident they would not be recognized. As night fell, the weather deteriorated rapidly, thunder rumbling in the distance. "There's a storm approaching, Your Grace," the driver called down. "Roads ahead may not be passable by morning." Thaddeus consulted his pocket watch with a frown. "How far to the next village?" "Millfield's about 3 miles on, but—" A brilliant flash of lightning illuminated the countryside, followed immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. The horses reared in terror, nearly overturning the carriage before the driver could regain control. "We need shelter now," Thaddeus decided, helping Seraphina from the carriage as rain began to lash down. "Is there anything closer?" "Old gamekeeper's cottage 1/2 mile through those woods," the driver shouted over the rising wind. "Been empty since Lord Hartley's estate was sold, but roof was sound last I saw it." "We'll make for it on foot," Thaddeus declared, collecting their small traveling bags. "Take the horses to Millfield and return for us at first light." With the driver dispatched, They set off into the woods, Thaddeus leading the way with a lantern while supporting Serafina with his free arm. The rain fell in blinding sheets, turning the forest path into treacherous mud within minutes. Twice Serafina nearly fell, saved only by Thaddeus's steady grip. "There," he finally called, indicating a dark shape ahead. The gamekeeper's cottage proved little more than a two-room structure with shuttered windows and a sagging porch, but its roof, as promised, remained intact. Thaddeus forced the door with his shoulder, ushering Serafina into the musty darkness. "A palace it is not," he observed wryly, lighting a candle stub he discovered on the mantelpiece. Serafina surveyed their sanctuary, a single main room with a stone fireplace, rough wooden table, and narrow bed frame stripped of its mattress. A smaller room beyond appeared to be a rudimentary kitchen. "At least we won't drown," she replied, attempting lightness despite her sodden clothes and chattering teeth. Thaddeus immediately set about creating a fire from the meager wood supply stacked beside the hearth. "You're freezing," he noted with concern. "There may be blankets in that trunk." The battered sea chest contained several musty but serviceable wool blankets, along with a folded oilcloth that Serafina immediately recognized as useful. "We should hang this across the window," she suggested, moving to cover the broken shutter that allowed rain to blow inside, and perhaps these smaller pieces could be laid on the floor for sitting. Working together, they soon transformed the abandoned cottage into a semblance of shelter. The fire blazed cheerfully, casting dancing shadows across the rough walls. Serafina spread blankets near the hearth to dry, while Thaddeus produced bread, cheese, and a flask of brandy from his traveling bag. "Hardly the dinner I intended for this evening," he apologized, offering her the simple provisions. "Perfect for the circumstances," she assured him, accepting a piece of bread gratefully. She had eaten nothing since their hasty departure that morning. As they shared the modest meal, the storm intensified, rain drumming against the roof and wind howling through gaps in the wooden walls. Despite these discomforts, Serafina found herself oddly at peace, perhaps because, for the first time since their marriage, she and Thaddeus were truly alone, stripped of the artifice that governed their interactions at Thornwick Hall. "Lyrian will be safe tonight at least," she said, breaking a companionable silence. "No one travels in such weather." "True." Thaddeus passed her the brandy flask. "This will help ward off the chill." The spirits burned pleasantly down her throat. "I never imagined the Duchess of Blackthorn would find herself stranded in a gamekeeper's cottage, drinking brandy from a flask," she mused. "I never imagined the Duke of Blackthorn would find himself grateful for such circumstances," he countered, a hint of warmth in his voice that had nothing to do with the fire. Their eyes met across the small space between them, and something electric passed between them, an acknowledgement of the strange intimacy forced upon them by situation and proximity. "Why did you really marry me, Thaddeus?" Serafina asked suddenly. The truth this time. He looked away, shadows accentuating the sharp planes of his face. "Initially for the reasons I stated, convenience, practicality, my father's will." His voice lowered. "But also because of what I did to you 5 years ago, a poor attempt at atonement perhaps. And now?" She scarcely dared breathe as she posed the question. A tremendous crash of thunder shook the cottage before he could answer. Serafina, startled visibly, instinctively moving closer to him. "Not fond of storms?" he asked softly. "They always frightened me as a child," she admitted. "My mother died during a thunderstorm. I was 7. Without premeditation, Thaddeus reached for her hand, his fingers warm as they enfolded hers. "I didn't know." "How could you?" she whispered. "We were strangers when we married. And now?" He echoed her earlier question, his eyes searching hers in the firelight. Before she could answer, a fresh torrent of rain found a new entry point, pouring through a section of roof directly above them. They scrambled away, laughing despite the sudden drenching, and found themselves pressed together in the one dry corner of the room. "For this cottage's charms diminish by the minute," Thaddeus observed, water dripping from his hair onto Serafina's shoulder. Their closeness was suddenly overwhelming, his breath warming her cheek, his arm a solid presence against her back. Serafina felt her heartbeat accelerate, aware of him not as her reluctant husband or as the Duke of Blackthorn, but simply as a man whose proximity affected her in ways she had long denied. "Serafina," he murmured, his voice strangely rough. "I should move—" "Don't," she whispered, surprising herself with the plea. "Stay." His eyes, normally so guarded, revealed a flicker of vulnerability that mirrored her own. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to retreat, Thaddeus lowered his head until his lips hovered a breath away from hers. "I have wanted this since I saw you descend the stairs on the night of the masquerade," he confessed. "Perhaps even before." "Then why deny us both?" she asked. "Because I do not deserve—" Serafina closed the final distance between them, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that began as hesitant exploration and rapidly transformed into something more urgent. Thaddeus responded instantly, one hand tangling in her damp hair while the other drew her closer, eliminating any remaining space between their bodies. Years of suppressed emotion poured into the exchange, her lingering hurt, his unspoken regret, and beneath it all, a current of desire neither had acknowledged until this moment. When they finally parted, both were breathing rapidly, eyes wide with the revelation of what had transpired. "This changes matters considerably," Thaddeus said hoarsely. "Does it?" Serafina touched his face, tracing the scar that marked his journey from the man who had hurt her to the one now holding her. "Or merely reveals what already existed?" He captured her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm that sent shivers through her entire body. "I have been a fool, Serafina, keeping you at arm's length when what I truly wanted was to draw you closer." "Why?" she asked simply. "Fear," he admitted. "Fear that I would become my father, cold, manipulative, unable to love without corrupting the object of that affection." His expression darkened. "You've read my childhood journals, haven't you?" She nodded, unwilling to deny it. "I found them by accident." "Then you know what manner of household shaped me." His thumb traced circles against her wrist, seemingly unconscious of the caress. "My father controlled through fear and obligation. My mother withered under his dominance, eventually seeking escape through laudanum until—" He broke off. "Until she died," Serafina finished gently. "The fever Mrs. Vex mentioned." "There was no fever." Thaddeus's voice hardened. "She took her own life with an overdose of her medicine. My father ensured the true nature of her death remained hidden to preserve the family reputation." "Oh, Thaddeus," Serafina breathed, understanding dawning. "You feared repeating the pattern." "I saw how my father's possessiveness destroyed her spirit long before her body surrendered," he confirmed. "I vowed never to cage another soul as he did hers." "There is a vast difference between possession and love," she observed quietly. "One diminishes, the other nourishes. And how would I recognize the distinction, having witnessed only the former?" His smile held bitter self-awareness. "So I maintained distance from you, from the possibility of repeating history." Serafina placed her hands on either side of his face, forcing him to meet her gaze. "You are not your father, Thaddeus. The very fact that you fear becoming him proves as much." Another kiss followed, slower and deeper than the first, a silent communication of understanding and forgiveness that words could not adequately express. When thunder crashed again, Serafina barely noticed, lost in the sanctuary of Thaddeus's embrace. The remainder of the night passed in quiet conversation, interspersed with increasingly tender exchanges as the storm gradually subsided outside. They spoke of their childhoods, their fears, their hopes beyond the immediate danger facing them. By dawn, when weak sunlight began filtering through the shuttered windows, something fundamental had shifted between them, a transformation as profound as it was unexpected. As they prepared to resume their journey to Bath, Thaddeus drew Serafina into one final embrace. "Whatever dangers await," he promised, "we face them together. Not as Duke and Duchess, not as convenient allies, but as partners in truth." "Partners," she agreed, sealing the covenant with a kiss. "In all things." The cottage that had sheltered them through the storm, humble, imperfect, yet ultimately sufficient, seemed an apt metaphor for the marriage they now committed to build, stronger for having weathered unexpected tempests, more precious for its hard-won security. The journey to Bath resumed at dawn, with Serafina and Thaddeus traveling in a heightened state of both urgency and intimacy. The carriage that collected them from the cottage bore the crest of a local squire, a precaution Thaddeus had arranged to avoid drawing attention as they neared their destination. "Lyrian is staying with my aunt at number 12 Royal Crescent," Serafina explained, as the elegant Georgian buildings of Bath came into view. "It would be prudent to approach discreetly rather than announce our arrival." "Agreed." Thaddeus consulted his pocket watch. "We'll stop several streets away and proceed on foot. Even in Bath, the Duke and Duchess of Blackthorn would draw notice." They alighted near the circus, Serafina drawing a simple cloak around her shoulders, while Thaddeus donned a less ostentatious hat than his usual beaver. As they navigated the bustling streets, he maintained a protective proximity, his hand occasionally brushing hers in a manner that would have seemed casual to observers, but sent currents of awareness through Serafina's body. The elegant curve of Royal Crescent appeared before them, its honey-colored stone glowing in the afternoon sun. Serafina led the way to number 12, mounting the steps with practiced familiarity. "Aunt Margaret receives callers at this hour," she murmured. "We may find Lirianne in her company." The butler who admitted them showed no recognition of either visitor, ushering them into a drawing room where Mrs. Margaret Whitfield entertained several guests with tea and animated conversation. Lirianne sat among them, looking remarkably polished in a gown of spring green silk, her dark hair arranged in fashionable ringlets. "Serafina," she exclaimed, rising immediately upon seeing her sister. "And your Grace. What an unexpected pleasure." The surprise in her voice was genuine, Serafina noted with relief. Perhaps they had arrived in time after all. "Forgive our unannounced visit," Thaddeus said smoothly, bowing over Mrs. Whitfield's extended hand. "Business brought us to Bath unexpectedly." "The Duke of Blackthorn in my humble drawing room," Mrs. Whitfield declared, clearly delighted by this social coup. "You must join us for tea." "Perhaps later," Serafina interjected. "I was hoping Lirianne might show us the pump room. I've heard such tales of its renovation." Understanding the subtle signal, Lirianne made their excuses to the assembled guests. Once safely outside, her composure gave way to excited curiosity. "What brings you both to Bath? Is something amiss at Thornwick Hall?" "Not there," Thaddeus replied grimly, "but potentially here. Tell me about your acquaintance with Mr. Oswin." Lirianne's eyes widened. "How did you know about him?" "Your letter," Serafina explained. "You mentioned his particular interest in my marriage." "He's been exceedingly attentive," Lirianne admitted as they walked toward the relative privacy of the nearby gardens. "Secured invitations to several exclusive gatherings, brought flowers, escorted me to the assembly rooms twice, and asked questions about Thornwick Hall," Thaddeus prompted. "Its layout, perhaps? Security arrangements?" Lirianne faltered. "Well, yes, but merely out of polite interest in my sister's new home. Surely you don't suspect—" "He is not what he seems, Lyrie," Serafina interrupted gently. "The man works for Lord Caldwell, who has significant grievances against Thaddeus." As they found a secluded bench in the gardens, Thaddeus provided a carefully edited version of the situation, emphasizing Oswin's dangerous nature, without revealing the full extent of the conspiracy. Lirianne's expression shifted from disbelief to horror as understanding dawned. "He invited me to accompany him to Lord Caldwell's country estate tomorrow," she whispered. "Said his lordship particularly wished to meet the sister-in-law of the Duke of Blackthorn." Thaddeus and Serafina exchanged alarmed glances. "You were to leave Bath?" he asked sharply. "Yes, in Lord Caldwell's private carriage. Oswin called it a great honor." Lirianne's voice trembled. "I nearly accepted." "Thank Providence you didn't," Serafina murmured, embracing her sister. "Once removed from Bath, who knows what might have happened?" "I believe we can hazard a guess," Thaddeus said darkly. "Caldwell intended to use you as leverage, to force me to surrender certain documents in exchange for your safe return." Tears welled in Lirianne's eyes. "I've been such a fool. He seemed so genuine, so interested in my opinions." "You couldn't have known," Serafina assured her. "These men are expert manipulators." Thaddeus rose, his expression hardening into something dangerous. "We must act swiftly. If Oswin discovers we've warned you, he'll report to Caldwell immediately." "What do you suggest?" Serafina asked. "A trap of our own." Thaddeus paced before them, formulating a plan. "Lirianne accepts Oswin's invitation, but requests he call upon her this evening to finalize arrangements. When he arrives, we'll be waiting." "To what end?" Lirianne asked nervously. "Information," Thaddeus replied. "Oswin is Caldwell's right hand, privy to details of the conspiracy that could expose the entire network." The plan was set in motion immediately. Lirianne dispatched a note to Oswin, suggesting he call at 8 o'clock to discuss their journey, while Thaddeus arranged for trusted men, former soldiers now employed on his estate, to position themselves discreetly around Mrs. Whitfield's home. "Are you certain this is wise?" Serafina asked as they prepared in the guest chamber. Aunt Margaret had insisted they occupy. "Confronting Oswin directly seems fraught with risk." "Less risky than allowing events to unfold according to Caldwell's design," Thaddeus countered, checking the priming on a small pistol before concealing it within his coat. "Oswin's capture provides us leverage, and if he refuses to cooperate." Thaddeus's expression grew somber. "Every man has his breaking point, Serafina, even one as hardened as Oswin." The cold determination in his voice reminded her of the stakes they faced, and the depths to which their enemies would sink. This was not a drawing room game, but a matter of life and death, with Lyrian's safety and Thaddeus's mission hanging in the balance. At precisely 8 o'clock, Edmund Oswin was announced. He entered Mrs. Whitfield's drawing room with the confidence of a man accustomed to moving in elevated circles, tall, impeccably dressed, with features that, while not handsome, possessed a certain charismatic intensity. His smile upon seeing Lyrian waiting alone appeared genuine, though it faltered slightly when Thaddeus emerged from the adjoining room. "Your Grace," he recovered smoothly. "What an unexpected pleasure." "I doubt that very much, Oswin," Thaddeus replied, positioning himself between the man and the door. "Or should I address you as Captain Reed? That was your name in Bombay, as I recall." Colour drained from Oswin's face. "There must be some misunderstanding." "None whatsoever," Thaddeus assured him coldly. "Your assignment to seduce information from Miss Lockwood was transparent from the beginning." Oswin's hand moved surreptitiously toward his coat, but Seraphina, who had entered silently behind him, pressed the barrel of Thaddeus's spare pistol against his spine. "I wouldn't," she advised quietly. "Unlike my sister, I harbor no illusions about your character." "The Duchess of Blackthorn," Oswin murmured, raising his hands slightly. "Rumors of your intelligence appear well-founded." "Sit," Thaddeus commanded, gesturing to a chair positioned away from windows. "We have matters to discuss regarding your employer." What followed was a tense interrogation, with Oswin initially denying any connection to Lord Caldwell's illicit activities. Gradually, as Thaddeus revealed the extent of his knowledge about the conspiracy, the man's demeanor shifted from feigned innocence to calculated negotiation. "What do you want?" he finally asked. "Protection? Money? Information?" Thaddeus replied. "The location of Caldwell's private papers, specifically those concerning shipments diverted from company holdings between 1812 and 1815. Oswin's laugh held no humor. "You ask for his destruction. He would see me dead first. He will see you transported to Australia for kidnapping regardless," Seraphina interjected. "The only question is whether you face that fate alone or with the protection of the Duke's influence." A tense silence followed as Oswin weighed his options. Finally, his shoulders slumped in resignation. "The papers you seek are at Ravenscroft, his country estate, hidden compartment behind the library fireplace." He looked up, desperation evident in his eyes. "I've given you what you want. Honor your word." "One final question," Thaddeus pressed. "The attack on Dr. Lockwood last year, was it Caldwell's doing?" Seraphina's grip on the pistol tightened as she awaited the answer. "Yes," Oswin admitted reluctantly. "The doctor treated one of our associates, recognized symptoms of opium poisoning, began asking questions about shipments arriving at private docks. Caldwell couldn't risk exposure." The confirmation of what Thaddeus had suspected, that her father's death was no accident but murder, struck Seraphina like a physical blow. Her vision blurred, the room suddenly tilting beneath her feet. "Sarah!" Lyrian's voice seemed to come from a great distance. Strong arms steadied her as the pistol slipped from her grasp. Thaddeus's face came into focus, his expression a mixture of concern and barely contained fury. "Breathe," he instructed quietly. "Stay with me." She nodded, forcing air into lungs that seemed to have forgotten their purpose. By the time she had regained her composure, Thaddeus's men had secured Oswin and escorted him from the house to a waiting carriage. "He will be held at a secure location until matters are resolved," Thaddeus explained. "Mrs. Whitfield has been told he was arrested for outstanding debts, a story that will satisfy society's curiosity temporarily." "My father," Seraphina whispered. "They killed him, and they will answer for it," Thaddeus promised, his voice hardening. "Every one of them." That night, after Lyrian had been settled with additional guards posted discreetly around Mrs. Whitfield's home, Seraphina and Thaddeus retired to their assigned chamber. The revelations of the day had left her emotionally drained, yet sleep remained elusive. "You knew," she said suddenly, breaking the silence as they lay side by side in the darkened room. "You suspected my father's death was connected to Caldwell's conspiracy before we came to Bath." Thaddeus turned toward her, his features barely visible in the moonlight filtering through the curtains. "I found references to him in Naira's encoded messages." She had compiled a list of inconvenient individuals who had been addressed by Caldwell's organization. "And yet you said nothing." The hurt in her voice was unmistakable. "I lacked proof," he admitted. "And He hesitated. I feared how you might react if I revealed your involvement in this affair was no coincidence, that I had pursued you as my wife partly because of your connection to another of Caldwell's victims. So our marriage truly was a strategic alliance from the beginning, Serafina murmured, bound by common enemies rather than affection. Initially, perhaps. His hand found hers beneath the covers, fingers interlacing. But what began as strategy has become something I scarcely dared hope for. The admission hovered between them, fragile yet profound. Serafina considered the journey that had brought them to this moment, from humiliation to reluctant partnership to this tentative, vulnerable connection. I should be furious with you, she observed, for using me, for concealing the truth about my father, for drawing my sister into danger. Yes, he agreed simply, you have every right to your anger. Yet, I find myself unable to sustain it. She turned to face him fully. Because wrapped within your deceptions was also a kind of justice, the opportunity to confront those responsible for my father's death. Thaddeus's hand rose to touch her cheek, his touch reverent in the darkness. You continue to astonish me, Serafina Evermont. The use of her married name, spoken with such evident respect, moved her unexpectedly. For the first time she felt the weight of her title, not as a burden or a disguise but as a true identity, earned through her own strength rather than bestowed by convenience. What happens now? She asked. Tomorrow we return to Thornwick Hall, he replied. The evidence Oswin provided gives us the final pieces needed to expose Caldwell and his associates. I've sent word to trusted officials in London, men beyond Caldwell's influence. Once the documents are secure, the entire conspiracy will unravel. And us? The question contained multitudes. His answer came not in words, but in the gentle press of his lips against hers, a promise more binding than their hasty marriage vows had been. The journey back to Thornwick Hall began early the following morning, after tearful farewells to Lyriane and assurances of her continued safety. As their carriage rolled through the countryside, Serafina found herself studying the landscape with new eyes, seeing not merely the physical terrain, but the complex web of power, wealth, and corruption that had shaped both their lives. They arrived at the estate by mid-afternoon to find Mrs. Vex awaiting them with uncharacteristic agitation. Visitors, Your Grace, she announced as they entered the grand hall. Lord Caldwell and Lady Wraithborn. They arrived an hour ago demanding an audience. Thaddeus and Serafina exchanged alarmed glances. Oswin must have managed to send a warning before his capture, he muttered. They're in the library, Mrs. Vex continued. I've stationed Simmons and Hillcrest nearby, as you instructed should unexpected guests arrive. Well done, Thaddeus approved, removing his traveling coat. This confrontation comes sooner than anticipated, but perhaps that's for the best. Shall I accompany you? Serafina asked, suddenly uncertain of her role in the impending clash. Thaddeus smiled grimly. Oh, I insist upon it. After all, what could be more natural than the Duke and Duchess greeting their distinguished guests together? The library doors opened to reveal Lord Caldwell examining a volume by the window, while Lady Morgause Wraithborn reclined elegantly on a chaise longue. Both looked up with practiced nonchalance that failed to mask the predatory alertness in their eyes. Blackthorn, Caldwell greeted, setting aside the book, and the lovely Duchess. How fortuitous that you've returned so promptly from your excursion. Hardly fortuitous, Thaddeus replied coolly. This is, after all, our home. The question is why you've chosen to visit it uninvited. Caldwell smiled thinly. A matter of mutual interest has arisen, one requiring immediate attention. Indeed? Serafina moved to stand beside her husband, her posture deliberately casual, as she noted the distinctive bulge of a pistol beneath Caldwell's impeccable coat. I wasn't aware we shared interests with either of you. Lady Morgause laughed softly. Such charming naivety, Your Grace. No wonder Thaddeus found you useful. Let us dispense with pretense, Caldwell interrupted, his genial facade hardening. My associate, Mr. Oswin, has gone missing under circumstances that suggest your involvement, Blackthorn. Additionally, certain documents have disappeared from my estate, documents that rightfully belong to the East India Company. Stolen company documents? How shocking, Thaddeus replied with mock concern. Perhaps you should report the matter to the board of directors. You know perfectly well why that's impossible, Caldwell snapped, patience visibly thinning. Those ledgers contain sensitive information about diverted shipments, embezzled funds, assassinations ordered against those who discovered your schemes. Thaddeus's voice remained conversational, even as he catalogued devastating accusations. Yes, I imagine the directors would find such information rather distressing. Caldwell's hand moved toward his concealed weapon, but Lady Morgause laid a restraining hand on his arm. Perhaps we've approached this incorrectly, she suggested smoothly. Thaddeus has always been susceptible to appropriate incentives. Her gaze shifted meaningfully to Serafina. The Duchess's sister, for instance. Such a lovely girl, currently residing in Bath with minimal protection. How interesting that you mention Lyrianne, Serafina countered, her apparent calm belying the rage burning within. She's actually en route to London as we speak, under escort by the Duke's most trusted men, along with Mr. Oswin, who has proved remarkably forthcoming about your activities. The shock on both visitors' faces confirmed they had not anticipated this development. Caldwell recovered first, his expression hardening into something truly dangerous. You've made a grave miscalculation, Blackthorne, he snarled, withdrawing his pistol. Those documents will be recovered one way or another. I think not, came a new voice from the doorway. Mrs. Vex stood with a loaded musket braced against her shoulder, its barrel aimed squarely at Caldwell's chest. Behind her, Simmons and Hillcrest appeared similarly armed. Lower your weapon, Lord Caldwell, the housekeeper instructed calmly. I've served the Evermont family for 30 years and would consider it a privilege to defend it with lethal force if necessary. A tense standoff ensued, broken finally by an unexpected development, as Lady Morgause produced a small derringer from her reticule, pointing it not at Thaddeus or Serafina, but at Caldwell himself. The game is lost, Robert, she declared coldly, and I have no intention of hanging for your ambitions. Caldwell stared at his former ally in disbelief. Morgause? You would betray me? I prefer to call it self-preservation, she replied. The evidence Blackthorne possesses implicates us both, but my involvement was peripheral. With appropriate testimony against you, I might yet salvage something from this disaster. As Caldwell processed this betrayal, Thaddeus moved with calculated precision to disarm him. A wise decision, Lady Wraithborn, though it comes rather late to earn my trust. I require only your mercy, not your trust, she responded pragmatically. In exchange for certain information your Indian contact never discovered, such as the location of additional ledgers documenting transactions with 3 members of Parliament. The confrontation's conclusion proved anticlimactic compared to its tense beginning. Both Caldwell and Lady Wraithborn were secured in separate chambers under guard, while Thaddeus dispatched messengers to London with sealed documents outlining the conspiracy and requesting official intervention. That evening, as they sat before the library fire reviewing the extraordinary events of recent days, Serafina found herself contemplating the strange path that had led to this moment. It seems almost inconceivable, she mused. My father's death, our marriage, Lyrianne's near abduction, all threads in a tapestry woven by Caldwell's greed, and now unraveled by his hubris, Thaddeus added, pouring brandy into 2 crystal glasses. By morning his co-conspirators in London will be under arrest. The evidence is irrefutable. Justice for my father, for Naira, for all those harmed by their schemes. Serafina accepted the offered glass, studying its amber depths. Yet I find it brings less comfort than I anticipated. Thaddeus seated himself beside her, his expression thoughtful. Justice rarely heals the wounds that necessitated it, he observed. It merely prevents new injuries of the same kind. Her cold consolation, she murmured. Perhaps. His hand found hers, fingers intertwining with natural ease. But not our only one. In the intimate glow of firelight, surrounded by books that had witnessed both betrayal and reconciliation within these walls, Serafina recognized the truth of his words. Vengeance had drawn them together, but something far more profound now bound them. A connection forged through shared danger, mutual respect, and the gradual surrender of carefully guarded hearts. As Thaddeus drew her closer, his kiss carrying the promise of a future neither had dared imagine, at the beginning of their unlikely alliance, Serafina acknowledged that while justice might be served through Caldwell's downfall, redemption had been achieved through their own transformation, from reluctant strangers to true partners, from calculated convenience to genuine love, and that, perhaps, was the greatest victory of all. A fortnight passed with remarkable swiftness following Lord Caldwell's arrest. Official investigations proceeded with unusual efficiency, spurred by the extensive evidence Thaddeus had compiled and the damning testimony provided by Lady Wraithborn in exchange for leniency. 3 members of Parliament resigned in disgrace, a senior admiral was court-martialed, and the East India Company faced unprecedented scrutiny of its operations both at home and abroad. For Serafina, however, these public developments held less significance than the private transformations occurring within the walls of Thornwick Hall. The grand manor that had initially felt like an elegant prison now became increasingly comfortable, a home rather than merely a residence. On a crisp autumn morning, she stood at her bedchamber window, watching fallen leaves dance across the formal gardens. The landscape had transformed since her arrival, summer's vivid greens yielding to the bronze and gold of October. Nature's cycle of renewal seemed a fitting metaphor for her own journey. A soft knock at the door preceded Flora's entrance with a silver breakfast tray. "Good morning, Your Grace. His Grace asked me to inform you he's been called to the village on an urgent matter, but expects to return by midday." "Thank you, Flora." Serafina accepted a cup of fragrant tea. "Did he mention the nature of this urgency?" "Something about Dr. Harrington requiring assistance," the maid replied, arranging toast and preserves on the small table by the window. The messenger seemed most insistent. Dr. Harrington, the elderly physician who had assumed her father's practice after his death. Concern flickered briefly, but Serafina dismissed it. Thaddeus had proven more than capable of handling unexpected challenges during recent weeks. After breakfast, she decided to visit the village herself. Though technically unnecessary, the Duchess of Blackthorn could simply summon anyone she wished to see. Serafina found herself increasingly drawn to the ordinary rhythms of the community that had been her home before marriage. The simple act of walking through familiar streets provided a grounding connection to her former life, a reminder of who she had been before becoming Her Grace. The carriage deposited her near the village green, from where she proceeded on foot toward the small medical practice her father had established 3 decades earlier. As she approached the modest building, Serafina was surprised to see Thaddeus's distinctive black stallion tethered outside. He had apparently recovered fully from the poisoning incident. Through the front window, she glimpsed an unexpected scene. Thaddeus in earnest conversation with Dr. Harrington, examining what appeared to be architectural drawings spread across the examination table. Both men looked up as the bell above the door announced her entrance. "Serafina?" Thaddeus straightened, a curious expression crossing his features. Surprise mingled with something resembling guilt. "I didn't expect you in the village today." "Evidently," she replied, glancing between them with undisguised curiosity. "Flora mentioned an urgent matter with Dr. Harrington. Is everything all right?" The elderly doctor cleared his throat. "Perfectly fine, Your Grace. His Grace was merely consulting me on a project requiring medical expertise." She moved closer to examine the drawings. "These look like plans for a building." "They are," Thaddeus admitted, making no attempt to conceal the documents now that she had seen them. Specifically, plans for a small hospital to serve the county. Serafina studied the detailed renderings with growing amazement. The proposed structure was elegant yet practical, 2 stories with separate wings for men and women, spacious wards designed to maximize natural light, and modern ventilation systems based on the latest medical theories. "This is remarkable," she murmured, tracing the layout with her fingertip. "When did you conceive this?" Thaddeus and Dr. Harrington exchanged glances. "It was your father's dream," the doctor explained gently. "He spoke of it often, a proper medical facility accessible to all, regardless of means. He had begun setting aside funds, though they proved insufficient." Understanding dawned slowly. "The debts my father accumulated were partially due to his investments in medical equipment and land for this purpose," Thaddeus confirmed. "Your father's financial difficulties stemmed not from irresponsibility, but from his commitment to improving healthcare for the community." Emotion welled unexpectedly in Serafina's throat. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I discovered the truth only recently," Thaddeus replied, moving to stand beside her. "While reviewing estate records after Caldwell's arrest, I found correspondence between your father and mine regarding potential funding for the hospital. My father had initially expressed interest, then abruptly withdrew support shortly before your father's death." "Another of Caldwell's interventions?" "Almost certainly. He would have viewed any alliance between our families, even a philanthropic one, as threatening to his influence over my father." Serafina absorbed this revelation in silence, her fingers still tracing the outlines of her father's unrealized vision. "And you intend to complete his work?" "With your guidance," Thaddeus said quietly. "I thought perhaps it might serve as a fitting memorial and a step toward healing some of the wounds inflicted by our family's past." The gesture, thoughtful, unexpected, perfectly aligned with her own values, touched Serafina deeply. Without concern for Dr. Harrington's presence, she reached for Thaddeus's hand, squeezing it in wordless gratitude. "The Duke has been most generous," Dr. Harrington noted, beaming with approval. "Not only funding construction, but establishing an endowment to ensure treatment remains available to those of limited means. Your father's expertise would be invaluable to the planning committee," Thaddeus added. "I had hoped to present the completed proposal as a surprise, but perhaps your direct involvement from the beginning would be more appropriate." "I would like that very much," Serafina replied softly. As they departed the physician's office a short while later, Serafina's mind buzzed with possibilities. The hospital project represented more than merely a memorial to her father. It offered purpose, a meaningful application of her position and privilege beyond the conventional social duties expected of a duchess. "You've been unusually quiet," Thaddeus observed as their carriage rolled through the village square. "Having second thoughts?" "Quite the opposite," she assured him. "I'm contemplating how to incorporate a training program for nurses. My father always believed proper nursing care was as essential as a physician's skill." Thaddeus smiled, the expression transforming his features in a way that still caught her by surprise. "I've created a monster, haven't I? The Duchess of Blackthorn, champion of medical reform. Would that displease you?" she asked, suddenly uncertain. "Displease me?" He took her hand, turning it to press a kiss against her palm. "Serafina, nothing would make me prouder than to see you pursue this passion. The Blackthorn name has been associated with power and privilege for generations. It's time it stood for something more substantial." The carriage continued past the village boundaries, but instead of taking the main drive toward Thornwick Hall, it turned onto a narrower lane that wound through a wooded section of the estate. "Where are we going?" Serafina inquired, noting the unfamiliar route. "One more surprise," Thaddeus replied enigmatically. "Indulge me a little longer." The lane eventually opened onto a clearing overlooking a small lake. Near the water's edge stood a charming stone cottage, recently renovated, judging by its fresh thatch and gleaming windows. "What is this place?" Serafina asked as Thaddeus helped her from the carriage. It was once the estate manager's residence, long abandoned when larger quarters were built closer to the main house. He guided her along a gravel path toward the cottage. "I thought perhaps we might use it as a private retreat, somewhere to escape the formality of Thornwick Hall occasionally." The interior proved as appealing as the exterior, simply but comfortably furnished, with a stone fireplace dominating the main room and windows positioned to capture the peaceful lake view. Unlike the Grand Manor with its imposing ancestral portraits and weighty traditions, the cottage offered sanctuary, a space untouched by painful memories or social expectations. "It's perfect," Serafina declared, turning to Thaddeus with genuine delight. "Though I confess I'm astonished by these gestures. The hospital, this cottage, they seem rather sudden developments." Thaddeus moved to the fireplace, his expression growing more serious. "Recent events have prompted considerable reflection," he admitted. "Caldwell's conspiracy has been dismantled, your father's death avenged, all the objectives that drove our marriage accomplished. And now you wonder what remains," she concluded quietly. "No." His denial came swiftly, emphatic. "I know precisely what remains, Serafina. The question is whether you wish it to continue." She studied him with sudden uncertainty. "I don't understand." Thaddeus drew a folded document from his coat pocket, placing it on the table between them. "These papers, when signed, would grant you complete financial independence. Your father's debts are formally forgiven, a generous settlement established in your name, and provisions made for Lyrian's security as well. You're offering me freedom," Serafina realized, staring at the document with mixed emotions. "I'm offering you choice," he corrected gently. "Our marriage began as a transaction, your hand in exchange for financial security. Those terms have been fulfilled. You are now free to determine whether the relationship continues and on what basis." The magnitude of the gesture, its respect for her autonomy, its acknowledgement of their unusual beginning, moved her deeply. Many men in Thaddeus's position would consider the matter settled, their ownership established through law and custom. Instead, he offered her the dignity of genuine consent, even at the risk of losing her. "And if I chose to leave?" she asked, needing to understand the full implications. "You would depart with my profound regret but complete support," he replied, his voice steady despite the emotion visible in his eyes. "Your reputation would remain intact, a story of amicable separation due to incompatibility, with no blame attached to either party." Serafina picked up the document, feeling its weight both physically and symbolically. And if I chose to stay? Thaddeus moved closer, though he refrained from touching her. Then we would begin again, not as Duke and Doctor's daughter, not as convenient allies, but as Thaddeus and Seraphina, building something genuine from the unusual foundation fate has provided us. The choice before her seemed both monumental and surprisingly simple. In the week since their night in the gamekeeper's cottage, Seraphina had observed Thaddeus not merely as her titled husband, but as a man struggling to reconcile his position with his principles, his past with his aspirations. She had witnessed his capacity for change, his willingness to confront his own failings, his growing openness to vulnerability. Without speaking, she moved to the fireplace and placed the document among the kindling laid ready for lighting. Thaddeus watched in silence as she struck a match and set the papers aflame, their legal provisions curling into ash as the fire took hold. "I believe that constitutes my answer," she said finally, turning to face him. The relief and joy that transformed his features confirmed she had made the right choice. Thaddeus closed the distance between them, gathering her into an embrace that conveyed more than words could express. "I do have one condition," Seraphina murmured against his shoulder. He drew back slightly, eyebrows raised. "Name it. This cottage becomes our true retreat, a place where titles remain at the door, where we are simply ourselves without the weight of Thornwick Hall's expectations." "Gladly," he agreed, his smile warming her more effectively than the crackling fire. "Though I suspect the servants will gossip terribly about the Duke and Duchess escaping to play at being commoners." "Let them gossip," Seraphina replied, rising on tiptoe to kiss him with a freedom that still felt wonderfully novel. "We've earned the right to write our own story now." The months that followed proved transformative for both Thornwick Hall and its occupants. Construction began on what would become the Lockerwood Memorial Hospital, with Seraphina taking an active role in its planning and eventual management. Lyrianne returned from Bath, her youthful spirits restored after the Oswin deception, and brought welcome energy to the manor with her musical talents and cheerful disposition. Most significant, however, was the gradual evolution of Seraphina and Thaddeus's relationship. What had begun as a business arrangement deepened into genuine partnership, mutual respect blossoming into affection and eventually into love. Not the innocent infatuation of her youth, but something more substantial. A mature attachment founded on shared experiences, common values, and hard-won understanding. On their first wedding anniversary, they celebrated not at Thornwick Hall, with the elaborate ball custom might have dictated, but at the lakeside cottage. As spring twilight settled over the water, they sat on the small porch, reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. "If someone had told me a year ago that I would find happiness in marriage to you," Seraphina mused, "I would have questioned their sanity." Thaddeus laughed, the sound no longer rare in her presence. "And I would have dismissed the very concept of happiness as irrelevant to our arrangement. How fortunate we were both mistaken." She leaned against his shoulder, content in the simple pleasure of proximity. Indeed, his arm curved around her waist, drawing her closer, though perhaps not entirely mistaken. "You recall I once told you our marriage was the most practical decision of my life. I remember thinking it a particularly unromantic sentiment," she teased. "Yet it proved prophetic," he countered. "For what could be more practical than aligning oneself permanently with the one person who challenges, supports, and understands you completely? Practicality and passion need not be opposing forces as it happens." "A convenient philosophy," Seraphina observed wryly. "I prefer to think of it as wisdom hardly deserved but gratefully accepted." His expression grew more serious as he took her hand, his thumb brushing over the wedding ring that had once represented obligation but now symbolized choice. "I have something for you, an anniversary gift, though perhaps an unconventional one." From his pocket he withdrew a delicate silver locket, not new but instantly recognizable. Seraphina's breath caught as she identified her mother's pendant, the one she had reluctantly sold to cover her father's medical expenses in his final illness. "How did you find it?" she whispered, accepting the precious object with trembling fingers. "With considerable effort," he admitted. "It had passed through several hands before I traced it to a jeweler in London." He hesitated before adding, "I hope you don't mind, but I took the liberty of adding something." Curious, Seraphina opened the locket. One side still contained the miniature portrait of her mother. The other, previously empty, now held a tiny painting of her father, expertly rendered despite its small size. "It seemed appropriate they should be reunited," Thaddeus explained softly. as your past and present have reconciled in ways neither of us could have foreseen. Words proved inadequate to express her gratitude. Instead, Serafina conveyed her feelings through a kiss that deepened with each passing moment, communicating everything that language could not capture: appreciation, tenderness, desire, and the profound certainty that this unlikely union had become her most treasured blessing. Later, as they lay together in the cottage's simple bedchamber, Serafina traced idle patterns across Thaddeus's chest, contemplating the news she had thus far kept to herself. "I visited Dr. Harrington yesterday," she began casually, "for a consultation unrelated to the hospital project." Thaddeus's hand, which had been stroking her hair, paused. "Are you unwell?" "Quite the opposite." She propped herself up to observe his expression in the candlelight. "It appears that approximately 7 months from now, Thornwick Hall will welcome a new Evermont." The transformation of his features, from confusion to dawning comprehension to unadulterated joy, confirmed that this man who had once represented her greatest humiliation had indeed become her most profound source of happiness. "Truly," he whispered, his hand moving reverently to rest against her still flat abdomen. "Truly," she confirmed, "Dr. Harrington is quite certain." Thaddeus gathered her close, his embrace conveying both tenderness and fierce protectiveness. "I never imagined such happiness possible," he confessed against her hair, "particularly not with the woman I once wounded so terribly." "Perhaps that's the most remarkable aspect of our story," Serafina reflected, "that genuine love can emerge from such unlikely beginnings." "Not unlikely," he corrected gently, "simply requiring more effort than the conventional path. The most precious metals, after all, must be refined through fire." As moonlight filtered through the cottage windows, casting silver patterns across their entwined figures, Serafina contemplated the extraordinary journey from that humiliating rejection 5 years earlier to this moment of perfect contentment. What had begun as a business arrangement, progressed through reluctant alliance and blossomed into genuine partnership, had finally transformed into something neither had dared imagine at the outset: a love story worthy of the novels she had once dismissed as fanciful. The Duke of Blackthorn had indeed returned to claim her hand, initially for vengeance disguised as necessity, but ultimately for love disguised as redemption. And in that transformation lay the true miracle of their unlikely union.